Please don't forget to subscribe, because a lot of people that watch my videos don't subscribe apparently, and hit that bell so you stay informed with the latest and greatest videos from this channel. I'm also live every day on twitch.tv/HasanAbi after 11 a.m. Pacific.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. In June of 2021, a military training document leaked to the public. In it was the following question: anarchists, socialists, and neo-Nazis represent which terrorist ideological category? The correct answer was political terrorists. In this episode, we're talking about terrorism, which means this video will probably be demonetized and age-restricted. So if you enjoy the work I'm doing and would like to support the channel, please do consider becoming a patron. Today we're covering the terminology, rhetoric, and history surrounding the use of this term to unpack exactly how we got here and what this means for the American left and the American public in general. Now, despite the Navy announcing it would be removing the entire training document in which this question appeared just a few days after The Intercept broke the story, it was too late. This leak shines a light on the endurance of the US's vision of the left as a dangerous subsection of the political public, and we're going to examine exactly how. Although this specific training question garnered a pretty sizable reaction, the language in this document is not especially unique. In many FBI and DHS documents, notably those from Biden's new National Strategy for Combating Domestic Terrorism, these agencies outline very clearly that they're responding to the threat of violence from both right-wing groups, like militia extremists, sovereign citizen extremists, and white supremacy extremists, as well as so-called black identity extremists, anarchist extremists, and environmental extremist groups on the left. Before we delve into the issues with this,
You know, the real extremists, boys. The ones historically designated as extremists.
Political
language, and these programs as a whole, we need to briefly talk about terrorism in general. Terrorism is a notoriously hard to define term. So much so that despite decades of deliberation, the UN has no agreed upon definition of the term. And for good reason. The problem with a single definition lies in positionality. Depending on where you stand, an act of violence can either be a deeply illegitimate and reprehensible use of terror, or its exact opposite. The obvious example is the freedom fighter/terrorist dilemma, but it goes much further. For starters, terrorism is typically defined by states or people thinking in terms of states. As a result, almost every definition of terrorism fails to include actions taken by governments or militaries. In this way, terrorism is just something that non-state actors do.
Yep.
This means
That's why whenever I say, like, the American government are the most successful terrorists on the planet, there's a lot of chatters who are, like, confused by that. They're like, what do you mean? Like, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense at all. That's like the American government. It's like, nope, they are way better at causing chaos and doing terror. You never say that. There are probably, like,
less than 3.
more than 100 viral videos of me saying exactly that. I say it literally all the fucking time. I suspect that since you've been following me starting July 10th, 2021, you are maybe unaware it's kind of all I say.
that even if two acts are otherwise indistinguishable, only one of them will be considered terrorism, the one in which the perpetrators aren't wearing army green. We'll come back to that
100 views equals viral. I fucking love my dumbass 17-month subscribers, dude. Yeah.
later. For now, let's return to the leaked document and the new anti-terrorism measures the US is implementing. These measures achieve two things. They drastically expand the power of the surveillance and police state, and two,
I think the chatter was claiming that you never say terrorism is hard to define. Cardi B soul sodas drip. Oh my god, dude. Cardi poppin'. Soda B. What the hell is a camel toe shoe? Oh, he's got the camel toe shoes. Yeah, that's weird.
They create a false equivalence between the left and the right. Both these things are incredibly dangerous. Let's begin with number 1. The US has something of a history with state responses to terrorism. After 9/11, the Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security massively increased the budgets and purview of domestic surveillance and policing in the US. Overnight, the FBI's top priority became protecting the US from terror attacks. And surveillance, which targeted Muslim communities in particular, expanded its reach. Enormous watch lists were created.
By the way, this video ties so perfectly into what we were just talking about. Like, I could not have found a better follow-up video to why I have legitimate concerns about just, you know, law enforcement agencies having access to everyone's DNA than this video as a follow-up to it. I reworked Peepo Haas for the Halloween season. Tax the rich, that includes you. Can't believe you said that, man.
Now including over 1 million people. And, as the Edward Snowden leaks have shown, the type of surveillance Americans and the citizens of allied nations were subjected to went far beyond a proportional response. Tens of millions of emails and phone records and countless terabytes of internet data from regular members of society were collected, stored, and analyzed by the NSA. Anybody could be wiretapped, and millions of Americans were. As you might expect,
thank you, Mooniverse, for the 5 gifted subs.
These programs too had incredibly biased results, disproportionately targeting Muslim and Black communities. At the same time, and with similar biases, local and state police forces became increasingly militarized, gaining access to weapons and surveillance equipment that were and continue to be directed against the American population with deadly consequences. In one example, Baltimore police forces were found to be using surveillance planes originally designed for aerial surveillance of Fallujah, Iran, on the majority Black western part of the city. The response to terrorism was militarization, essentially using a domestic army to occupy our own country, something the rest of the world is only too familiar with. And although 9/11 saw the most dramatic expansion in surveillance and policing measures,
They did this on, here's another great example, and it's not just like Black people in poor neighborhoods or anything. They did this exact same thing under the Obama administration against the North Dakota Access Pipeline protesters. That's right. Obama did the exact same thing to water protectors and climate change activists.
in the name of anti-terrorism, this issue goes back a lot further and explains many of the biases we see today. For over a century, the FBI in particular has targeted the Black community and Black activists with disproportionate force. In declassified documents, it was revealed that Ida B. Wells and Marcus Garvey, two iconic early 20th century activists, were marked as race agitators. And later in the century, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Black Panthers were all targeted by COINTELPRO, an intelligence program run by the FBI that assassinated and falsely imprisoned activists, illegally tampered with the justice system to push convictions, and funded right-wing paramilitaries in the US to go after left-wing and civil rights organizations. In the name of national security, US intelligence systematically targeted advocates of a more just society, illegally and with deadly accuracy. Current anti-terrorism measures are operating in similar ways. To be fair, the current administration's plan accurately acknowledges that white supremacist and right-wing terror is the dominant domestic terrorist threat in the US. That being said, The claim of terrorism is used to justify intensifying the already expansive surveillance and policing of the American people, and widening the scope of who can be punished and for what by tying legal repercussions to the imprecise and fungible term that is terrorism. All the while, these measures silently equate the right and the left. That is point number 2. Buried in the documents released by the Biden administration is a false equivalence between the left and the right. Socialists are placed on the same plane as neo-Nazis. And while the document is widely publicized as going after the white supremacist right, anti-capitalists are just as much of a target. But there's a problem here. There is a huge difference between these two sides of the political spectrum. For one thing, there is a major difference in scale. As we've already seen, white supremacists are responsible for far more casualties than their left-wing or Islamist counterparts today. So much so that in 8 of the past 26 years, every single death to a domestic terrorist incident was the product of a right-wing group or individual. And since 1994, right-wing...
Damn, dude, it's crazy. I thought Muslims were responsible. I thought black identity extremists like BLM protesters and Muslims were, taking over the lion's share of terror. It turns out, never mind, it's actually anti-white.
Protect the top of the hour every hour.
Never mind, it's actually anti-white, or not anti-white, sorry. It's actually anti-government white nationalists. Oh. The government can't stop you from seeing the ad breaks at the top of the hour. That dono is correct. If you want an ad-free broadcasting experience, the only thing that can stop you from seeing those ads, the only thing that will stop you from seeing those ads is a subscription, which is $5 a month, or free if you have a Twitch Prime. Okay? It's true. It's literally fucking true. I'm sorry. I will say it. Fuck it, dude. I'm saying it. But it is true. Now, those are the ways you can avoid them. You can also use an ad blocker or a VPN, but Twitch Prime is free. Do with that information what you will. Here's a 1-minute ad break now.
Attacks and plots also make up the majority of domestic terrorism incidents in the US, whether they're fatal or not. By contrast, while some left-wing terrorist attacks are fatal, the majority of left-wing terrorism has been directed against property and consisted simply of acts.
Why are you so sad today? I'm not. I'm just really, really, really tired. That's it. I'm incredibly tired. I'm not sad at all. I'm very happy, actually. I miss streaming like this.
Acts of vandalism. These things are not the same, and that difference is a product of the history of white supremacy in the US. In the words of a report by Andre M. Perry at the Brookings Institute, Antifa did not deem black people 3/5 human in the Constitution. Supposedly radical left-wing hate groups did not tilt housing markets to facilitate wealth for white people while simultaneously denying black citizens similar opportunities. The radical left doesn't have a long, sordid history of terrorism, including lynching, cross-burning, church bombings, and mass shootings that explicitly sought to suppress black voting and our right to peaceful protest. A system of white supremacy did do all those things. So there's a problem with equating these two threats. But that's not all. At the heart of this narrative is the idea that it is only political extremism that relies on violence, and that the moderate, centrist institutions of our government today present a safe alternative to acts of terror. That is incorrect. In order for the current political system to survive, and even come into existence in the first place, a tremendous amount of violence must be exerted by the government.
Dude. I can't believe, like, the lack of protections that the Chinese Communist government offers its journalists. Like, really frustrating to see these Chinese officers in Communist China beat the shit out of these brave Chinese broadcasters, these brave Chinese journalists, for the crime of covering the atrocities in Communist China. It's just like, you will never see images like this in a free country like the United States of America. You know? That would never happen. Portland, China? No, this is actually in Washington, D.C., China. The nation's capital. This image. That's right. It's the Chinese capital city of Washington, D.C. Yeah.
We see this in the repression of civil rights and racial justice movements, where violence carried out by intelligence, police, or military forces is right in front of us. We see it in the endless wars carried out by the United States and its allies in foreign countries, where civilians are regularly killed at the hands of drone strikes in the name of the war on terror. We see it in the destruction of natural habitats. We see it in our day-to-day lives when millions are kept in poverty, away from shelter, food, or healthcare, despite the government's ability to satisfy these needs for everyone. When funds are withheld and people starve, are evicted, or die mere feet from the machines that can save their lives, that too is violence. If none of these—
Oh yeah, I forgot. That wasn't... This might come as a surprise, but that was in the United States of America.
These examples convince you, consider the extremes of this state power we've seen in events like the Tulsa Race Massacre and the Philadelphia Move bombing. In Tulsa, white mobs formed and descended on black residents living in the most prosperous black neighborhood in the US at the
They dropped fucking bombs from planes, dude.
time. Armed and given deputy status by the city, the mob attacked the neighborhood alongside the city police, burning over 35 blocks, injuring and displacing thousands, and killing dozens of innocent people. In Philadelphia, the government literally bombed a residential neighborhood in which lived an anti-government black rights organization the city was trying to evict. 11 people were killed, a city block was demolished, and 250 people were displaced.
Bro, they dropped a bag of C4. Like, they literally dropped a bag of C4. Police chief at the time said, let it burn. This was in 1985, chat.
Hassle.
Hassan, wouldn't you believe that there might be context that we don't know? There is absolutely zero. Like, there are certain things that you can't do no matter what. Like, no matter how weird the Africa family might be to you, okay? There is no appropriate angle to justify blowing up an entire fucking city block, dude. That's insane. Like, dropping a fucking bag full of C4 from a helicopter, from a police helicopter, and burning fucking an entire city block with like children in it. That's insane. That's like saying like, oh, well, you know, when thinking about the Holocaust, like there might be perhaps some context that we don't know. Like, no, it's like completely inhumane, unacceptable thing to do.
And made homeless. Terrorism has never been unique to the extremes. But there is another aspect to the public equivalence between the far left and the far right. The use case of terrorism serves as a publicly permissible way for a neoliberal and centrist government to equate fascism and socialism in general. While center-left politicians are typically wary of criticizing socialists outright since they form an important part of their voting bloc, they see a popular socialist movement as a threat to their, at best, social democratic and capitalist government. As a result, many governments like to position themselves so that they can attract their necessary socialist voting base by decrying fascism as it encroaches on the right and simultaneously keeping their corporate sponsors happy by not actively ceding any ground to the socialists that support them while undermining them more privately. It's obvious anti-socialism, but well hidden from the average American's view. We've covered how this happens in the public sphere over the long term in a video about the ratchet effect. As always, that video and the sources for this one are in the description. But the ratchet effect doesn't give us the full picture of the issue. It explains the structural factors that allow for centrist parties to shift progressively towards the right in two-party democracies. What's missing are the moments where an actively anti-socialist agenda paves the way for a fascist regime. While this certainly exists in American politics, historically, the greatest evidence of this phenomenon is in Latin America. Let's go back to the Cold War. All around the world, communist and socialist governments are forming, inspired and at times aided by the USSR. Leftist politics started gaining traction in a multitude of Latin American countries, both through electoral politics and regime-changing popular revolutions. This posed an existential threat to the US and its own global capitalist regime. A global economy organized around the communist ideals of equality and cooperation would pose a fundamental contradiction to the exploitative capitalism the US had begun exporting abroad, and would break the neo-colonial chains that were forming between the global South and the more powerful global North, which enabled the legal ransacking of resource-rich nations of their wealth and power. Around this time, in Latin America particularly, US-based companies had taken over large swaths of land and actively resisted growing movements for its redistribution. One company in particular, United Fruit, now Chiquita, developed an exploitative banana trade in neighboring tropical countries where it could establish a monopoly over the fruit markets for incredibly low labor costs. To preserve this lucrative operation, United Fruit did several things. They actively subdued any efforts to redistribute land to an increasingly mobilized peasant class. They paid off national armies to shoot and kill workers striking for better pay and working conditions. And when all else failed, they got the US government involved. The US strategy relied on its own set of bad practices. There are the obvious coups, election interferences, and military interventions, of course. But there was a lot more violence exerted by the US, directly or indirectly, and often in ways that fit the US's own definition of terrorism. For example, a major factor in the US strategy was the funding of right-wing paramilitary groups. Under the direction of the Reagan, Johnson, Kennedy, and Nixon administrations, right-wing terrorists were supplied with arms and funds in exchange for the installation of US-friendly regimes in Latin American countries, regardless of the war crimes and acts of terror committed by these groups to achieve this goal or preserve their status. Not only—
Oh my God. Pre-watch. I was about to say, not only did they overlook those war crimes, they literally trained them to do war crimes, which I'm sure he's just about to fucking admit. Like, they literally actively trained paramilitary death squads to engage in like torture methods and war crimes.
were brutal atrocities committed in order to install these, quote, business-friendly regimes. But once in power, these governments exerted savage right-wing authoritarian force, and
Never mind, he didn't mention that.
could reasonably be considered fascist in many cases. This was most famously the case in Chile. Under Nixon's direction, Chile went from electing a democratic socialist, President Salvador Allende, to becoming a full-blown fascist dictatorship under Pinochet. The history of Pinochet's rise to power is not like most other fascists. Unlike Hitler or Mussolini, Pinochet did not gain his status by preying on economic anxieties and racial resentment within the general public.
That's the original 9/11, folks. That's literally the OG 9/11. That also happened on 9/11. Only 9/11 Chile.
Working through the electoral system to consolidate power in times of crisis, and eventually emerging with far more control than was afforded to him. Instead, he was brought to power by the United States. Anticipating the success of the Allende campaign, the US led massive propaganda efforts against the left-wing leader, alleging he would abandon the democratic principles he espoused once elected, while in the background, the US funneled money to more business-friendly parties. When those methods failed and Allende was elected to the presidency, Nixon cut financial aid to Chile entirely and imposed brutal economic sanctions. At the same time, the CIA garnered support within the Chilean military for a coup to oust the president, luring Chilean forces with the promises of arms and even more funding, an effort that ultimately proved successful when Pinochet took power. Thus began decades of state-led terrorism.
Man. Socialism is sure unpopular. So unpopular that we actively have to fucking murder or overtake socialist governments that democratically vote in socialist leadership.
Under the Pinochet government, an estimated 30 to 40,000 people were victims of human rights violations. Torture, executions, and exiles were rampant and directed especially towards Chilean leftists on a scale so massive it is often referred to as a political genocide. Aided by the United States and its Operation Condor, the Chilean government instituted a regime of terror under the pretense
I think it's a bit inaccurate to call Pinochet a fascist, a dictator for sure, but he lacks a lot of the qualities that we would consider fascist. Yeah, like he only threw people out of helicopters, like he didn't gas them in chambers. Totally, man. Thanks. Thanks for the clarity on that.
Go Bearcats.
of preventing leftist terrorism, the scale of which never threatened the regime by most accounts, and was far eclipsed by the actions taken by the government against its own citizens. The takeaway here is that in resistance to a democratic socialist government, the US favored an undemocratic, far-right authoritarian dictatorship under which acts of genocide, terrorism, torture, and untold human suffering were committed just so domestic industries could get Chilean copper a little cheaper. At the end of the day, what constitutes terrorism is highly subjective. For the US, that definition has never been precise nor uniformly applied, and the result of this approach has almost always been the undermining of the left and silencing of racial minorities while far-right actors gain funding, support, and power. Under the guise of an issue that has universal support, reducing acts of terrorism, state powers are better able to enforce their own forms of violence, both domestically and abroad. As we've seen, that has hardly reduced terror in the world. As the world marches into an uncertain future, with major existential crises looming on the horizon, we need to be aware of this trend. We will see a resurgence of outright fascism within liberal democracies as they begin to struggle against economic collapse. And with this resurgence will come principled left-wing resistance. When given the choice between the two, I hope it's obvious which side is morally correct. And just so we're all on the same page, the other side will have the support of the United States. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. When I decided to make the shift from general interest stuff to more radical political content, I knew I ran the risk of sinking my channel and losing my ad revenue and sponsors. These days, it's pretty hard